The hum of the SSS Horizon's engines was the only constant in the cold expanse of space. It vibrated through the ship's metal bones, filling the endless silence beyond the walls. Dr. Eliza Renfield stood at the viewport of her quarters, staring out into the void. The darkness stretched on, vast and oppressive, swallowing the stars one by one the closer they drew to the nebula. X-91. The name echoed in her mind, as though it had a weight all its own, a gravity that pulled at her thoughts. It had been 6 months since the ship had left Earth, and the journey had been uneventful, routine even. Until now. Now, the closer they came to X-91, the more everything felt wrong. The nebula loomed ahead, a shadow in the dark, visible only by the faint, unnatural swirl of gas and starlight at its edge. There was something about it that unnerved her, something she couldn't quite put into words. She tore her eyes away from the window, but the unease clung to her like the cold of space itself. The familiar voice of the ship's AI, Zenith, broke the silence. Dr. Renfield, the captain, has requested all senior crew members to the command deck. Eliza blinked, her mind pulling itself back from the abyss. "Acknowledged," she replied, her voice too loud in the stillness. She exhaled slowly, brushing a strand of dark hair behind her ear, then headed for the door. As she moved through the narrow corridors of the Horizon, she felt the eyes of the ship on her. The dim lighting flickered slightly, and the usual mechanical sounds seemed muted, as if the ship itself was holding its breath. She told herself it was just nerves. After all, who wouldn't be on edge? The Horizon was the first manned vessel to reach this far into deep space, sent to study a cosmic anomaly that had baffled scientists for decades. But there was something more than just the anxiety of discovery lingering in her thoughts. At the entrance to the command deck, the heavy door slid open with a soft hiss. Inside, Captain Marcus Voss stood before the central display, his broad shoulders tense. His jaw was set in a hard line as he stared at the visual feed of X-91, a swirling mass of darkness blotting out the stars. The other senior crew members were already there. Dr. Karim, the ship's chief engineer, pacing in front of the instrument panel, Lieutenant Quinn, the communications officer, her fingers drumming nervously on the arm of her chair, and Dahl, the ship's navigator, standing stiffly at attention. Eliza took her place at the science station, her hands brushing over the cool surface of the console. The soft glow of the monitors cast strange shadows on everyone's faces, deepening the lines of tension. "Status report," Captain Voss said without turning. His voice was steady, but there was an edge to it, something strained. Dr. Karim, a wiry man with sharp eyes, spoke first. "All systems are operating within normal parameters, but..." He hesitated, his eyes flicking nervously to the main display. "The ship's sensors have been picking up an anomalous signal. It's faint, almost like background radiation, but it's unnatural. I've never seen anything like it." "What kind of signal?" Eliza asked, leaning forward. Her fingers flew over her console, pulling up the data stream from the ship's sensors. The screen lit up with a series of low-frequency pulses, barely noticeable against the usual cosmic noise. But there was something rhythmic about it, something intentional. "That's the problem," Karim said, running a hand through his graying hair. "It's too structured to be random, but there's no identifiable source. It's just there. It's almost like something is reaching out." Eliza felt a chill run down her spine. Her eyes flicked to the image of X-91 on the screen. It looked like a gaping maw in the fabric of the universe, a void where the rules of reality seemed to falter. And now it was whispering to them. Captain Voss turned to face the crew, his blue eyes hard as ice. This isn't a coincidence. That signal, whatever it is, started when we crossed the outer edge of the nebula's boundary. We've been picking it up for the last 12 hours, and it's getting stronger the closer we get. I don't believe in cosmic accidents. Neither did Eliza. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stared at the growing mass of data on her screen. The signal was intensifying, and with it came a rising sense of dread. Something was waiting for them in that darkness, something old and patient. "What's our proximity to the nebula's core?" Voss asked, breaking the tense silence. Dahl, the navigator, tapped a few keys. "We're approximately 6 hours away, assuming we maintain current speed." Eliza's hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her readings. The closer they got, the more distorted the data became. Space itself seemed to bend around X-91, as if the nebula was warping the very fabric of the universe. She glanced up at the captain, her voice quiet but insistent. "I think we need to reconsider our approach. We don't know what's in there, and the further we go, the more it feels like we're walking into something dangerous." Captain Voss nodded slowly, but his eyes remained fixed on the display. "I've already sent a report to Earth, but with communication delays this far out, we won't get a response for another few hours. In the meantime, we proceed with caution." Eliza bit her lip, the knot in her stomach tightening. "And if the signal gets stronger?" Voss's eyes darkened. "Then we turn back." A murmur rippled through the room, but no one argued. The decision to turn back felt like a lifeline, but it also felt like a lie. Eliza couldn't shake the feeling that once they crossed a certain threshold, there would be no turning back at all. That night, Eliza lay in her bunk, staring at the ceiling. The constant hum of the ship that usually lulled her to sleep now felt oppressive, like it was pressing down on her chest. She couldn't stop thinking about the signal, about what might be waiting for them at the heart of the nebula. The darkness outside her window felt deeper, colder. Just as her eyes started to close, the soft beep of her monitor broke the silence. Her breath hitched in her throat as she glanced at the screen. The signal had spiked again. The rhythmic pulse was stronger now, louder. She swore she could almost hear it through the walls, like a heartbeat echoing through the ship. And then she heard something else, a whisper, faint but unmistakable. It wasn't coming from her monitor. It was coming from the darkened corners of her room, from the shadows themselves. "Eliza!" Her heart froze. She shot up in bed, her pulse racing, her eyes scanning the room. There was no one there, just the dim light of the ship's systems and the cold, unblinking stars outside. But the whisper was real, and somewhere in the deep void beyond, something was whispering back. The SS horizon drifted through the cold, inky darkness, a solitary speck lost in the infinite. The nebula, X-91R, loomed larger now, its tendrils of swirling gases twisting like smoke around the edges of the ship's sensors. Inside the vessel, the air was heavy with tension. Something unseen had settled over the crew, like a thin layer of frost clinging to every surface. Unseen, but undeniable. Eliza sat alone in the mess hall, her untouched cup of coffee growing cold between her hands. Her mind was clouded with a growing unease she couldn't shake. it wasn't just the signal anymore. She had heard it again the previous night, the voice from the shadows whispering her name in a tone that was both intimate and alien. Eliza. She hadn't told anyone. What would she say? That she was hearing voices? That the void beyond the ship was talking to her? She could already picture the looks of concern, the suggestions to take a break, to sleep more. But she knew what she had heard. It wasn't a dream. Something was inside her mind now, prying into her thoughts, trying to pull her deeper. Her gaze shifted to the viewport, where the edge of X-91 seemed to ripple with faint, almost imperceptible movements. There was something alive in that darkness, something waiting. The sound of approaching footsteps broke her thoughts. Dr. Karim, looking even more haggard than usual, slid into the seat across from her. His eyes were bloodshot, and his skin had the pallor of someone who hadn't slept in days. "Eliza," he said quietly, leaning in. "You're hearing it, aren't you?" She froze, her hands tightening around the mug. "What do you mean?" "The voices," he whispered, his eyes darting around the room as if afraid something might overhear them. "The ship, the darkness outside, it's whispering. I've heard it. At first I thought it was just the engine hum or maybe the stress, but it's not. It's real." A cold shiver crept down Eliza's spine. She opened her mouth to respond, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she nodded, the silent confirmation settling between them like a terrible truth. Karim leaned back, his hands shaking as he ran them through his thinning hair. "I don't know what's out there, but it's getting inside our heads. Last night I saw something moving in the walls, like a shadow, but it wasn't just a shadow, it was watching me." He exhaled shakily. "I've been checking the systems non-stop. There's nothing wrong with the ship, but we're all acting like something's about to break." Eliza glanced around the mess hall, where the few other crew members who were awake sat in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. There was an air of paranoia now, an unspoken fear that no one wanted to acknowledge. Captain Voss had grown distant, his once commanding presence now fractured by long silences and sudden outbursts. Lieutenant Quinn, usually chatty and upbeat, barely spoke anymore, her eyes hollow, her hands constantly fidgeting. Even the ship's AI, Zenith, seemed different. Its voice was slower, almost deliberate, as if it were considering every word before speaking, as if it too was listening to the void. The situation deteriorated rapidly over the next few days. The signal, now unmistakable, pulsed through the ship like a heartbeat, growing louder and more insistent with each passing hour. Eliza could hear it in the walls, in the soft hum of the ventilation system, in the faint hum of the engines. It throbbed at the edges of her awareness, drawing her attention like a persistent itch she couldn't scratch. Captain Voss called another meeting in the command deck, but this time the atmosphere was even more strained. He stood stiffly at the front of the room, his normally confident demeanor frayed at the edges. "We've received no response from Earth," he said, his voice tight. "The signal is interfering with our communications. Every attempt to send a message is being distorted, blocked by something out there." Eliza exchanged a glance with Dr. Karim, who was sitting across the room, his face pale and drawn. He had barely slept in days. None of them had. "We don't know what's causing the interference," Voss continued, his gaze flickering to the main display where the nebula loomed. "But I'm starting to believe this isn't a natural phenomenon. Something is watching us." A murmur of unease rippled through the room. Eliza shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her mind racing. Watching them, she had felt that too. The presence, the unseen eyes following her every move. But hearing the captain say it aloud made it real, made it impossible to dismiss as just her imagination. "What do we do?" Quinn asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Captain Voss's jaw tightened. "We proceed with caution. If we can pinpoint the source of the signal, we may be able to shut it down or at least mitigate its effects. But for now, we maintain course." No one argued, but the silence that followed was thick with doubt. That night, the ship was quieter than usual. The steady hum of the engine seemed softer, as though even they were holding their breath. Eliza lay in her bunk, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. She hadn't been able to sleep for days, not properly. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the same thing. A vast, swirling mass of darkness, tendrils reaching out from it like the arms of some ancient, forgotten creature. It was calling to her, pulling at her thoughts, dragging her deeper into the abyss. She heard the whisper again. "Eliza." Her breath caught in her throat. She sat up, heart racing, her hands clutching the edge of her blanket. The room was dark, but there was something else. A presence. She could feel it watching her from the shadows, its gaze cold and patient. She reached for the light switch on her bedside console, her fingers trembling. The moment the room was bathed in soft, artificial light, the whisper stopped. But the sense of being watched didn't. "Eliza." This time the voice wasn't distant, it was right behind her. She whipped around, her pulse thundering in her ears, but there was nothing there. Only the empty room, the soft hum of the ship's systems, and the silence pressing in from all sides. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she climbed out of bed and stumbled toward the door. She needed to see someone, talk to someone, anything to make sure she wasn't losing her mind. But as she stepped into the corridor, the ship's lights flickered. The ship had never felt this dark before. The corridor stretched out before her, and at the end, something moved. She froze, her heart stopping in her chest. The lights flickered again, and in that brief moment of darkness, she saw it, just for a second. A shadow, tall and impossibly thin, standing at the edge of her vision. When the lights came back on, it was gone. She turned and ran. Down the empty hallways, past the silent rooms. Her footsteps echoed against the walls, but the sound felt distant, as if muffled by the oppressive weight of the void outside. She reached the control room, breathless, her heart hammering in her chest. Captain Voss was already there, standing in front of the main console, staring out into the nebula. "Captain," her voice trembled. He didn't respond. Eliza stepped closer, her skin crawling with a sense of wrongness. The captain stood rigid, his back to her, but something was off. His body was too still, his posture too tense, as though he were frozen in place. She could hear him whispering something under his breath. "Captain Voss?" she asked again, her voice barely above a whisper. Slowly he turned to face her. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and his mouth moved soundlessly, as if he were trying to speak but couldn't find the words. "Eliza," he finally croaked, his voice hoarse and broken. "They're here." The days blurred into each other aboard the SS Horizon. Time itself seemed to warp the closer they drew to the nebula. X-91. It was as if the ship had become untethered, drifting not just through space but through something deeper, something more insidious. The familiar rhythms of life aboard the vessel were falling apart. Sleep cycles had become fragmented, conversations devolved into hushed murmurs or, more often, abrupt silences as crew members stared, wide-eyed and vacant, into the void. Eliza felt the weight of the nebula pressing in on her mind. It wasn't just the isolation of deep space anymore. It was something much worse. The signal, that cursed pulsing rhythm, never stopped now. It was inside the ship's walls, inside their heads, growing louder every hour. In the mirror of her small bathroom, Eliza barely recognized herself. Dark circles clung to her eyes, her skin pale and slick with a sheen of cold sweat. Her hand trembled as she reached for a cup of water, the chill of the metal shaking through her fingers. She hadn't slept in what felt like days, maybe longer. Whenever she tried, the dreams would come. Dark, terrible dreams of endless space, of creatures swimming through the blackness with too many eyes, too many limbs. The nightmares felt too real, and when she woke, she could still hear them, whispering, "Eliza." She shuddered, pushing the thought away. It was getting harder and harder to distinguish between dreams and reality. The ship's systems were still functioning, though barely. Zenith, the AI, had started behaving strangely. It paused during routine commands as if considering each response, its tone growing more distant. When it did speak, its voice seemed colder, like it wasn't the system's automated responses anymore, but something else, something that was listening through it, mimicking it. Eliza could feel the intelligence behind it now, and it wasn't human. And it wasn't just Zenith. Eliza wasn't the only one losing her grip. Dr. Karim, the chief engineer, was unraveling faster than the rest of them. The man who had once been meticulous, controlled, now muttered constantly under his breath, pacing the ship's halls. His eyes darted from shadow to shadow, never resting, always searching for something just beyond sight. He claimed the ship's systems were being tampered with by an outside force, but no one else could see what he did. Eliza had seen him scratching at the walls, his nails leaving faint trails on the cold steel. His once steady hands now shook uncontrollably, and his face, gaunt and pale, bore the weight of some invisible burden. "It's the dark," he had said to her one night, eyes wild. "It's inside the ship. Can't you feel it? It's waiting for us." He wasn't wrong. Eliza felt it too. The air itself seemed to pulse, and the shadows in the corridors had a thickness to them, as if they were no longer just the absence of light, but something more tangible, something alive. Later that day, Eliza made her way to the control room, her steps slower, more deliberate. Each movement felt heavier than the last, as if the gravity of the nebula was pulling at her bones, dragging her closer to it. The lights in the hallway flickered, something they had been doing more frequently in the past few days. When she reached the control room, she found Captain Marcus Voss standing in front of the main console, staring blankly at the display of the nebula. His skin was sallow, his once strong frame now hunched and weak. His eyes were bloodshot, and his lips moved, though no sound came out. Eliza had seen him like this before, distant, lost in whatever madness had begun to consume him. He was the last bastion of authority aboard the Horizon, but even he was crumbling under the weight of the cosmic pressure. "Captain!" Eliza's voice was hoarse. He didn't answer. Her gaze flicked to the display and her stomach churned. X-91 had swallowed everything. The stars were gone, the distant galaxies erased from the viewport, as if the ship had slipped into a different dimension. The nebula now filled the screen, A swirling vortex of blackness shot through with veins of sickly green and purple. It was no longer just a mass of dust and gas. It moved like a living thing, pulsating with a rhythm that matched the signal they'd been receiving. The closer they got, the more alive it became. "Voss," Eliza said again, stepping closer. Suddenly his head snapped toward her, his bloodshot eyes locking onto hers. "It's awake," he whispered, his voice broken and distant. "It knows we're here." "What knows?" Eliza's heart raced. She didn't want to ask, didn't want to know, but the words tumbled out of her before she could stop them. Voss swallowed hard, his lips trembling. The nebula, the thing inside, it was imprisoned here, and now it's waking up. We woke it. Eliza's blood ran cold. She had suspected something like this, an intelligence, a presence, but to hear it confirmed by Voss sent a spike of terror through her. "We need to turn back," she said, more to herself than to him. "We need to leave." "We can't," Voss muttered. "It won't let us." His words hung in the air like a death sentence. As the hours dragged on, more strange things began to happen. The ship's systems, which had held together up until now, started to fail in rapid succession. The lights flickered erratically, communications went offline, and the temperature fluctuated wildly from freezing to sweltering. Zenith's voice had grown even more unnerving. The AI now spoke in whispers, its tone almost taunting, mimicking the voices they had all begun hearing in their minds. "Eliza! Eliza!" It called to her constantly, a low, seductive murmur that echoed through the ship's corridors. She could hear it even when no one else was around. And then there were the shapes, the shadowy figures that seemed to move just at the edge of her vision. Always there, always watching. But whenever she turned to face them, they were gone. Dr. Karim was the first to die. They found him in the engine room, his body twisted into an unnatural position, eyes wide with terror. There were no signs of a struggle, no external wounds, just a look of pure, abject horror frozen on his face. His fingernails were torn, the walls around him scratched and gouged where he had tried to claw his way out of the room. Eliza stood over his body, numb, unable to process the reality of what had happened. This wasn't supposed to happen. They were supposed to be scientists, explorers pushing the boundaries of human understanding, not victims of some ancient cosmic force. Quinn had tried to rationalize it. "Maybe he just snapped," she had said, her voice trembling. "The stress, the isolation, it's enough to drive anyone mad." But Eliza knew better. This wasn't stress. This was something far worse. Karim had seen something. He had been shown the truth, and it had killed him. And now, it was coming for them. The nightmares became constant. Each time Eliza closed her eyes, she was drawn deeper into the heart of X-91. She saw it now, the thing that was waiting for them. It was vast, incomprehensibly large, its form shifting and writhing in the depths of the nebula. Tendrils of darkness stretched out from it, wrapping themselves around her mind, pulling her closer. In her dreams, it spoke to her in a language that wasn't made for human understanding, a sound that twisted in her mind like the tendrils themselves. It showed her visions of the universe folding in on itself, stars collapsing into nothing, time and space warping until they were indistinguishable from madness. It showed her the truth. The universe was a fragile thing, and beyond its edges, there were forces older and more terrible than anything humanity could comprehend. X-91 wasn't a nebula at all. It was a prison, a prison for a god. Eliza woke each time with a scream lodged in her throat, her body drenched in cold sweat. The ship felt like a coffin now, a fragile shell floating in the depths of a reality they were never meant to see. The nebula pulsed outside the viewport, closer than ever, alive and watching. There was no turning back. The SS Horizon was dead. It drifted in silence, its once bright corridors darkened, the hum of its engines reduced to an eerie, unnatural stillness. The few remaining lights flickered weakly, casting long, jagged shadows along the cold metal walls. The ship, once a testament to humanity's triumph over the unknown, now felt like a tomb, floating aimlessly at the edge of an incomprehensible void. Eliza moved through the ship, her steps slow, measured. She was the only one left now. She had stopped counting the days since the others had succumbed, either to madness or to something worse. Karim's twisted body had been the first sign, and then Captain Voss's broken mind had followed. His whispers had grown frantic, desperate, until one day he simply vanished into the shadows. Eliza didn't know if he had thrown himself into the airlock, wandered off into the ship's infinite darkness, or simply ceased to exist altogether. All she knew was that he was gone, just like the others. She could feel it, the presence that had been watching them since they crossed the threshold into X-91. It was awake now, fully awake, and its awareness pressed down on her like a suffocating weight. She could feel it in her skull, crawling inside her thoughts. It didn't speak in words anymore. There was no need. It communicated in raw, primal sensations, terror, awe, the pull of an abyss so deep it swallowed her soul. Eliza. The whisper had followed her for days, a constant companion in the ship's darkened halls. But now it was louder, clearer. It no longer seemed to come from the ship or the void outside. It came from within her own mind, winding through her thoughts like a serpent. She knew with a dreadful certainty that the end was near. The thing inside the nebula wanted her. It had always wanted her. Her hands trembled as she walked through the control room one last time. The main viewport displayed the heart of the nebula, now filling the entire screen. It writhed with impossible colors, the blackness shot through with veins of pulsating light that seemed to reach out, almost like tendrils beckoning her. The stars were long gone, swallowed by the vastness of X-91. There was nothing left but the endless, roiling darkness. She couldn't tell if she was moving toward it or if it was pulling her in. A quiet voice broke the silence. Zenith. The AI still operational, but barely. Its tone was no longer cold or mechanical. It was soothing, almost comforting, like the soft murmur of a familiar lullaby. "We have arrived, Doctor." "Renfield," it said, the voice uncomfortably close to a human whisper. "The final coordinates have been reached." Eliza stared at the screen, her heart pounding in her chest. "Is this it?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Is this what we came for?" There was a pause, and for a moment, Eliza wondered if Zenith had been consumed by the entity as well. But then it spoke again, its words tinged with something she couldn't quite place, something like reverence. "This is what was always here," it replied, "what you were meant to find." Eliza swallowed hard, her throat dry. She had known, deep down, that this was never a scientific mission. This was a summons. They had been drawn here, not by curiosity or ambition, but by something far older, far more malevolent. The whispers, the visions, the unrelenting pull, it had all been leading to this moment. With a shudder, she reached out and pressed her hand against the glass of the viewport, her fingers trembling against the cold surface. The nebula shifted, coiling in on itself, and for the first time she saw it clearly, the thing that had been waiting for them. It was vast, its form stretching beyond the limits of her understanding. It was both there and not there, flickering in and out of existence, a creature of pure darkness and light, shifting in ways that defied reason. Eyes, thousands of eyes, opened within the swirling chaos, each one gazing directly into her soul. Tendrils of shadow snaked out from the core, twisting and writhing, searching for something. For her. Eliza's breath caught in her throat as the tendrils reached for the ship, their movement slow and deliberate, as though savoring the moment. She could feel the entity's mind pressing against hers, a cold, infinite intelligence so far beyond human comprehension that it threatened to tear her apart. It was a god, a being of cosmic power, imprisoned for eons, waiting for its chance to escape. It had used the horizon to free itself. Used her. The realization struck her like a physical blow, and she staggered backward, her heart pounding in her chest. They had been nothing but tools, sacrifices to a force so old, so powerful, that it had shaped the very fabric of the universe. The nebula wasn't a phenomenon to be studied. It was a trap, a prison, and now it was open. Eliza, the voice whispered again, but this time it was different. It wasn't the faint, distant call she had grown used to. It was right there inside her mind, as if the entity was speaking directly into her thoughts. You are the key. You have always been the key. She fell to her knees, clutching her head as the weight of the voice pressed down on her, the pressure building inside her skull. Images flashed before her eyes, entire galaxies collapsing, stars being devoured by black holes, time and space folding in on themselves as the entity consumed everything in its path. You are one with me, the voice said, calm and cold. You were always one with me. Eliza gasped, her vision blurring. The thing wasn't just reaching for her. It was inside her. She had never been separate from it. All this time she had been a part of it, a fragment of its consciousness sent out into the universe to bring it back. She had thought she was a scientist, an explorer on the edge of discovery, but she had been nothing more than a vessel, a carrier for the thing that had waited in the nebula for eons. Her mind buckled under the weight of the truth. There was no escape. There never had been. In the final moments, Eliza felt a strange sense of calm wash over her. The fear, the madness, the chaos, it all faded away, replaced by a cold, clear understanding. She was no longer Eliza Renfield, no longer a human being clinging to the edge of the universe. She was part of something far greater, something older and more terrible than she could have ever imagined. She was the key. She had always been the key. As the tendrils of darkness reached the ship, wrapping themselves around the horizon like the arms of a long-lost lover, Eliza closed her eyes. The ship shuddered, its metal groaning under the pressure, but she didn't fight it. She didn't scream. There was no need. This was how it was meant to be. The darkness swallowed her, and for the briefest of moments, she saw the universe as it truly was. Fragile, insignificant, a flicker of light in an endless, devouring void. And then the light went out. Back on Earth, a faint transmission was received by Mission Control, a broken, garbled message barely recognizable as human speech. It was the last thing anyone ever heard from the SS Horizon. "They are coming." The signal cut off abruptly, and the feed went silent. No one dared to send another ship. Commander Elias Voss tightened his grip on the ship's console as the Obsidian Dawn slowed to a hover, the derelict station looming ahead like a specter against the distant stars. It was old, orbiting the dark side of a dim, nameless planet in the vast emptiness beyond any charted route. This far out, the radio signals were faint, barely more than a distorted whisper, as if some unseen hand held it just out of reach. Engineer Leah Tran's voice crackled over the comms. "Commander, there's barely any power running through it. Whatever's left is minimal, just enough to keep that weak distress signal pulsing. Can you pinpoint the origin of the signal?" Voss's voice was steady, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the air around him had grown colder the moment they'd approached. "No way to know. It's everywhere and nowhere," Leah replied, tapping frantically at her console as though trying to pry more information from it. "This place is ancient. Not just the design. Its energy readings are practically alien." The ship connected with a heavy shudder as they docked, and the gangway extended with a hiss. Voss took a long breath, tightening the strap of his suit as he led the crew into the yawning maw of the station. The door slid open, revealing a dark corridor, steeped in thick shadows and flickering light that seemed to shrink back from their intrusion. The air inside was stale, carrying a faint metallic tang that hinted at long-neglected machinery and something else. Soren Hayes, the medic, recoiled slightly, his nose wrinkling beneath his helmet. "Smells like old blood," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. They moved forward, each step seeming to sink into the silence that pressed against them, absorbing sound and trapping it in an uneasy void. As they ventured deeper, the sight of smeared handprints streaked across the walls became impossible to ignore. Some of the prints were barely visible, as if made by a light touch, while others dragged downward in frantic lines. "What happened here?" Navigator Jace Calloway whispered, his eyes darting nervously over his shoulder. They reached what had once been the control room, now dark and cluttered with scattered papers and broken glass. Empty monitors stared back at them like hollow eyes, and blackened wires dangled from the ceiling, swaying ever so slightly as though recently disturbed. Leah moved to the main console, trying to power it up, but the system only sputtered, screen static flashing before a message scrolled across in a language none of them recognized, a language that seemed more symbol than word, each letter twisting in a shape that hurt to look at for too long. "It's not responding," Leah said, a strange edge to her voice. She blinked, shaking her head slightly as if clearing some fog from her mind. Voss approached a dusty control panel on the wall, a thin layer of frost still clinging to it, and traced his gloved fingers over an engraved plate that read X01 Meridian. The words felt alien, as if the station itself was an intruder, trespassing into their reality from some shadowed place. They moved further into the dim corridors, the walls gradually narrowing until they felt claustrophobic. The air grew colder and the smell intensified, becoming almost sweetly metallic, a coppery tang that seemed to coat their throats. Then, scattered across the floor, they found the first signs of the former crew: abandoned boots, half-scorched uniforms, a cracked helmet with a dark smear inside. One by one, the artifacts appeared like twisted breadcrumbs, leading them deeper into the station. Commander Voss's gaze lingered on a wall near what might have been the cafeteria. Scrawled across the surface in jagged, frenzied lines were messages that spoke of horrors unseen, scrawled in the same cryptic language from the control room. Words here and there were legible, but they made no sense. Echo, void eyes, no escape. His hand hovered over the wall, trembling as he felt the words sinking into him, infecting his mind with a sickening sense of recognition. He shook his head, forcing his thoughts back into order. "Keep moving," he ordered, his voice harsher than intended. The station's labyrinthine corridors twisted and turned, as if leading them intentionally deeper, further from their ship and from the promise of safety. As they pressed on, snippets of scattered logs appeared on the floor and consoles. Leah picked up a torn page, its writing faded and smeared, but she could just make out a line. "It watches from the dark beyond the stars. We're not alone. We were never alone." The words burned in her mind long after she put the page down. A creeping dread took hold of her, and she glanced down the dark corridor, catching a brief glimpse of something moving at the edge of her vision. A shadow, shifting like liquid, fading into the wall. She shook her head, trying to dismiss it as a trick of the light, but Soren's tense face told her he had seen it too. They all had. Jace's voice trembled. "This place, it feels like it's watching us, like it knows we're here." And as they continued on, the shadows seemed to grow thicker, more pronounced, stretching into shapes that lingered just a heartbeat too long. Every step forward felt like they were being drawn into something deeper, darker, something that was patient, lying in wait. They came upon a massive bulkhead door marked living quarters, its surface scratched and marred by deep gouges. The handle was cold, unnaturally so, and Leah had to strain against it before it finally yielded, opening with a groan that echoed down the hall. Inside, they found the rooms littered with fragments of shattered mirrors, torn fabric, and strange symbols smeared in dark streaks across the walls. As Voss looked closer, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The smeared symbols seemed to pulse, like faintly beating hearts, as though alive. The corridor lights dimmed for a moment, casting the room into utter darkness. And in that silence, that sudden, unnatural blackness, they all heard it, a faint whisper that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, low and guttural, like a rasping breath filled with hate. They froze, each one feeling the weight of the station's darkness pressing in around them. The voice spoke, a hollow and distant sound that was neither human nor machine, carrying the promise of something far worse than they could have imagined. "Come, closer." The lights flickered back on, and they found themselves staring at each other, faces pale and filled with fear. Voss's heart hammered in his chest as he struggled to regain control of himself, to suppress the suffocating sense of dread that filled him. "We're leaving," he said, voice trembling but resolute. "We're done here, this station. It's not what we thought." But even as they turned to retrace their steps, they found themselves facing an impossible sight. The corridor behind them was gone, replaced by an unfamiliar passageway that stretched into the uncharted dark, twisting away into the shadows. And just beyond their sight, something moved, waiting, its presence a silent threat, as certain as death, as sure as the void itself. The crew was trapped, and the darkness was closing in. The darkness in the meridian clung to them, thick and suffocating, as though every corridor exhaled a toxic, invisible mist. Commander Elias Voss led the way, yet with each step, A sinister feeling gnawed at his resolve, a sense that they weren't meant to be here, that the air itself wanted them out. Or worse, that it wanted them to stay forever. As they ventured deeper, the walls seemed to pulse, shifting with something close to a heartbeat, a low thrum that resonated in their bones. Engineer Leah Tran slowed her pace, examining the wall nearest her. She traced a faint trail of symbols with a gloved hand, each twisting mark like a memory forgotten and misshapen by time. "What are you seeing?" Voss asked, noticing her hesitation. "These symbols, they're like nothing I've ever seen, but somehow I feel like I know them," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She tore her gaze away, but the symbols seemed to follow her, lingering in her mind even as she moved on. Medic Soren Hayes kept his eyes averted, unsettled by the shadows which seemed to shift just beyond his field of vision. He caught himself glancing back repeatedly, certain he'd seen something watching, just out of sight. He wasn't alone in this. Jace was beginning to feel it too. The team pressed forward until they reached what remained of the station's data logs. Leah crouched by a console, prying open a brittle access panel, and began coaxing power back into the system. Her hands trembled as the screen flickered to life. Fractured recordings and corrupted audio files surfaced, snippets from the former crew. Her breath caught as she skimmed through the files, voice after voice warped and strained, and something else, an incessant whispering in the background of every log. She pulled up the first clear recording. The figure on the screen was barely recognizable, the crew member's eyes hollow, hair matted, mouth twitching with a haunting, blank stare. "If you're seeing this, it's already too late. We heard the voices. It started as whispers. Just the station, we thought. But then, we started seeing things. People, but not people. They just stand there, staring, waiting." The screen fizzled, the image briefly warping, then another voice took over, more desperate. "It's in the walls, in our heads. The Meridian is alive and it's hungry. It makes you see things, feel things that aren't yours. It digs inside, plants seeds of..." The voice was swallowed by static, and Leah closed her eyes, willing the image from her mind. But the voice lingered, an echo that seemed to wrap around her thoughts. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, barely audible. Voss's gaze was steel. "The crew before us, they went mad. Whatever's here, it feeds on the mind. We need to stay alert, resist any influence." But the truth was, they'd all started hearing things. Soft, unsteady voices, names whispered by unseen mouths. Words that felt familiar but wrong, somehow corrupted, replaying memories with subtle changes, each one disturbing in ways that defied reason. Jace felt it too. Each step he took, he felt the walls pressing in on him, felt eyes on his back that he knew weren't there but somehow were. And when he blinked, the walls seemed to inch closer, closer, the symbols carved into them dancing at the edge of his vision. "Voss," Jace whispered, his face pale. "Are we sure this place isn't playing tricks on us? It feels like it's in my head, taking my memories, twisting them into..." His words trailed off as he caught sight of his reflection in a cracked panel nearby. The image that stared back was him, but wrong. His own eyes blackened, mouth stretched into an unfamiliar, mocking grin. He staggered back, blinking, only to find the reflection gone, replaced with the unyielding metal panel. Voss tried to steady Jace, keeping his voice calm, but his own mind was splintering. He felt things in his own head he couldn't shake. Memories, childhood ones buried deep, resurfaced without reason, tainted by the shadows that surrounded them now. "Let's keep moving," Voss muttered, urging them forward. They reached a small crew quarters, a chamber cluttered with belongings left in disarray like they'd been abandoned in haste. Bunk beds lined the walls, and strewn across the floor were personal items: a tattered book, a watch with a cracked face, photos with faces scratched out. Soren felt drawn to the far corner where an open journal lay, its pages frantically scribbled. He picked it up, scanning the pages, feeling the former occupant's words seeping into his mind. I can't sleep, I can't think. There are voices in the vents whispering my name, but I see no one. Every time I close my eyes, they get closer. I can feel them, pressing into my skin, into my mind. The void. It has eyes, it has hands. It's calling me, saying things I can't ignore. It wants all of me. Soren's hands shook and he dropped the journal, stepping back as if the words themselves had teeth. He heard something in his mind, a voice, soft, pleading. He couldn't tell if it was his own. "Are we even real?" he murmured, his gaze unfocused. "Or are we just parts of this place, pieces of it, waiting to be absorbed?" Voss's head snapped up at the question, a chill crawling up his spine. He felt the same thoughts gnawing at the edges of his mind. They couldn't afford to lose themselves, not here, not to whatever ancient hunger pulsed beneath this twisted metal. As they tried to retreat, the hallways seemed to shift, stretching and contorting, leading them not back to their ship, but deeper toward a large circular chamber with a massive view window on one side. Outside, the planet loomed, a dark, desolate sphere draped in shadow, devoid of light. But as they looked, something faint flickered, a shadow moving, stretching across the planet's surface as though alive. Leah's eyes widened. "It's watching us. Whatever it is, it's right there." A low rumble filled the chamber, vibrating through the floor, through their bones, as if something far larger and far older was stirring, awakening to their presence. The feeling intensified, a sense of wrongness so profound it clawed at their very sanity. Soren closed his eyes, but the darkness behind his eyelids only brought more visions, each one sharper, more vivid. Shadows pressed into him, voices growing louder, insistent. "You're part of me," a voice hissed, guttural and familiar, a twisted version of his own thoughts. "You've always been here." He opened his eyes, but nothing felt real. His body was weightless, his mind detached, floating somewhere between the memory of who he'd been and the new, twisted self. The station seemed intent on crafting. Jace broke the silence, his voice a hollow echo. "What if we're just echoes of everyone who's come before? People like us, people who thought they'd leave." The thought settled over them like ash. No one spoke. They felt it, that sense of something immense, a being that wasn't just within the station, but that was the station, an entity born from the fear, despair, and memories of all who'd wandered into its grip and never escaped. Voss tried to rally, tried to remind himself that he was a commander, that he had people to protect. But even his own words felt like empty echoes, a hollow reassurance that dissolved into silence. He glanced at his team, each one of them staring into the darkness with eyes that seemed to dim, as if they were losing their hold on what was real. He looked into the shadows and thought he could see their faces mirrored back at him, twisted, waiting. A whisper rose from the void, a sickly promise creeping over them like smoke. "You belong to me." The crew didn't need to speak to know they felt it. The sense that something was inside them now, a parasite feeding on their fear, gnawing at their minds, twisting every thought into a weapon turned against themselves. The station pulsed, as if satisfied. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows deepening, and each of them knew with a horrible clarity that they were no longer alone. And perhaps they never had been. The corridors of the Meridian grew narrower and colder, the walls seeming to breathe as the darkness around the crew thickened. Every step felt heavier, the air so dense that Commander Voss wondered if it was weighing on their minds as much as their bodies. A faint, almost imperceptible hum permeated the walls, resonating like a heartbeat, a slow, deep throb that set their teeth on edge. As they moved further in, Voss tried to keep his focus, urging his team to stay close. "We're getting out of here. This place can't be endless," he muttered, trying to reassure them. But even as he spoke, he felt the words hollowing out, replaced by a dreadful certainty that the station was changing around them, trapping them in its bowels. They reached a wide, circular chamber, its walls painted with strange, smeared markings that spiraled into darkness. It was a strange mural, depicting shapes that slithered and pulsed as if they had life of their own. The markings, however, weren't the worst of it. Flickering lights cast long, reaching shadows across the room. Shadows that didn't match the outlines of their bodies but moved with a life of their own, stretching, shifting, and growing darker as if consuming what little light remained. Jace was the first to notice, his voice barely more than a whisper. "The shadows. They're not ours." Voss turned, dread pooling in his gut. The shadows indeed seemed alive, slithering over the walls, converging into a single dark mass. The mass undulated, forming shapes that looked unsettlingly human, arms reaching, fingers curling. It stretched across the wall, spilling onto the floor, its edges fraying like tendrils reaching toward them. Medic Soren clutched his head, his eyes wide and unfocused. "I can feel them, inside my head, like they're crawling in." His voice was tight with fear, and his hands shook as he backed away from the spreading shadows. Leah turned to Voss, her voice tense. "They aren't just shadows. They're memories, fragments of people who came before us. I don't know how, but I can feel them trying to dig into my mind, trying to make a home there." It wasn't just fear. Voss could feel it too, a low scratching inside his mind, as if something were trying to carve itself into his thoughts. He was suddenly overtaken by a vision. Himself, standing alone on the station, no team, no ship, staring into the same darkness and speaking in a voice that wasn't his. A flash of terror jolted him back to the present, but the memory felt wrong, like it belonged to someone else, like he'd stepped into another life for just a moment. "We're leaving," he ordered, trying to keep his voice steady. But the shadows seemed to sense his fear, drawing closer, whispering with faint voices that were almost familiar. They formed strange, shifting faces, features stretching, mouths wide in silent screams. One of the shadows peeled from the wall, stretching upward and taking on a familiar shape. It looked like a man, pale, gaunt, his face hollow with fear, his eyes wide with horror, yet strangely familiar. Voss recognized him as one of the former Meridian crew members, someone he'd seen in the logs. The Shadow Man's mouth moved, his eyes fixed on Voss. Yet no sound came out. Then, in a voice as faint as a sigh, he whispered, "We became them. You will too." Voss stumbled back, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he watched the figure dissipate, slipping back into the writhing shadows. He felt it then, a certainty deep and unshakable. The crew members from before weren't gone. They had become part of the station, their souls, or perhaps only their fears, melded into the shadows that haunted every inch of this cursed place. Jace was whispering to himself, his hands clenched at his sides. "It's calling my name, over and over. I can hear it in my head." He glanced at the others, his eyes wild. "It's like it knows every fear I've ever had, every memory. It's feeding off them." Leah's voice wavered as she tried to reassure him. "Stay with us, Jace. Just keep moving." But the shadows had already found their way into Jace's mind. His own shadow seemed to twist and writhe against the floor, taking on unnatural forms, limbs stretching out into tendrils that reached toward him. He backed up, shaking his head in horror as he saw the darkness mimic his every movement, every expression, every tremor of fear. He tried to outrun it, stumbling down the corridor, but his shadow only grew, a monstrous extension of himself, echoing his terror. Then came a voice, a low, crawling whisper that sounded like him, but warped and hollow. "There's nowhere to run, Jace. You belong to the darkness." Jace screamed, his voice swallowed almost instantly by the dense silence of the station. The others tried to reach him, but the shadows pulled back, closing around him like a web. They watched helplessly as he struggled, his figure growing dimmer, dissolving into the shadows until he was only a faint outline, his scream lingering as a distorted echo. When the shadows pulled back, Jace was gone, leaving only a faint, shivering imprint in the darkness where he'd stood. The rest of the crew was frozen in shock, horror-stricken, yet somehow they couldn't bring themselves to mourn. It was as if the station was dulling their emotions, turning grief into something flat, almost mechanical. Soren's voice broke the silence, low and shaking. "If we stay here, that's what's waiting for all of us." The remaining three tried to press on, but the corridors grew increasingly narrow, almost suffocating. The shadows seemed thicker, denser, pressing in from all sides. Leah, usually so level-headed, now stared at the walls with wide, terrified eyes. She kept touching her own shadow, as if to reassure herself that she was still separate from it, that it hadn't yet claimed her. Then she stopped, frozen as her shadow moved independently, its arms reaching out, fingers stretching toward her throat. Her eyes went wide, her breath hitching in her throat as she felt its cold touch wrap around her, squeezing, the pressure increasing as though it were trying to snuff out her very existence. She gasped, clawing at the invisible grip. "Voss, it's taking me," she choked, her voice strangled. Voss tried to pull her away, but the shadow had already seeped into her, its darkness filling her eyes until they went glassy, unseeing. She slumped to the ground, her body a husk, her spirit absorbed into the darkness, her mind a faint echo whispering in the void. Her voice, twisted and warped, joined the others, repeating a single haunting phrase. "I am the shadows. I am the station. We are eternal." Voss felt his own sanity slipping, his heart pounding with dread as he realized he was the last one left. He could feel the shadows seeping into his own mind, memories twisting and shifting as they rewrote his very thoughts, breaking him down, making him part of their endless horror. Alone now, Voss stumbled through the endless labyrinthine corridors. Everywhere he turned, he saw faint glimpses of his crew in the shadows: Jace, Leah, Soren. Faces that stretched and grinned, mocking him, pulling him deeper, their voices rising in a haunting chorus that echoed in his head. The station itself seemed to speak, its voice a horrible symphony of every soul it had claimed. "You are not lost. You are home." And then, in a moment of sickening clarity, he understood. The Meridian wasn't just a derelict station. It was an entity, a living, insatiable creature that consumed the minds of its crew, devouring their memories, their fears, their very souls, turning them into part of its eternal darkness. Voss felt the last of his strength leave him, his vision blurring as he stumbled forward, his shadow stretching out before him like a grotesque twin. It reached back toward him, clawing at his own body, dragging him into the floor, into the very structure of the station. In those final moments, Voss saw himself, fractured and broken, his face melting into darkness, his voice joining the cacophony of those who came before. His last coherent thought was the taste of despair, a bitter reminder that no one would remember him, that he would become nothing more than another voice in the endless whispering shadows. And then, with a final, shuddering breath, he felt himself dissolve, his last memory sinking into the station's depths, consumed by the living shadows. The silence in the Meridian had changed. It was no longer the thick, pressing quiet of deep space. Now it felt alive, an entity draped over Commander Voss like a shroud, smothering his thoughts, muting his senses. The corridors pulsed in and out of darkness, the lights flickering like dying stars. He stumbled forward alone, his heart beating erratically, each step pulling him deeper into the station's yawning maw. His crew was gone, devoured by the shadowed thing that lived within the Meridian. Jace, Leah, Soren, all of them absorbed into its dark hunger, their voices now part of the whispers that echoed faintly in his ears. Those whispers, familiar, taunting, almost comforting in their cold finality, urged him onward, guiding him through winding passages that shifted, stretching before him like veins in some great, malevolent beast. The walls seemed closer now, encasing him in their oppressive grip, breathing in sync with his ragged breaths. Every inch of him screamed to flee, to escape the suffocating darkness, but a different, deeper part of him knew there was nowhere to go. He was woven into this place now, entangled in its twisted web. The truth gnawed at him, a dreadful understanding that each step he took was not a choice but a pull, drawing him to the center of the Meridian, to the core of whatever horror lay in wait. He reached the heart of the station, a cavernous, circular chamber, its walls covered in symbols that seemed to writhe and pulse with an unnatural life. The symbols coiled and twisted, almost beckoning, and as he watched, the marks shifted into faces, contorted and writhing in agony. Among them, he could make out his crew's faces, twisted into grotesque expressions of fear and despair, their eyes hollow, empty of life yet brimming with an awareness that clawed at his sanity. "Welcome, Elias." The voice was everywhere and nowhere, a cacophony of countless others merged into one cold, calculating consciousness. It sounded like his own voice, only darker, drained of any humanity, carrying a resonance that rippled through his bones. He clutched his head, feeling the weight of those voices bearing down on him. They dug into his mind, memories and thoughts warping, pulling him apart at the seams. He could feel their stories, their fears, all the souls the Meridian had consumed, each one twisted into a ghostly echo. "What are you?" he managed to choke out, his voice barely a whisper, as if the station itself were swallowing his words. The symbols on the walls began to glow faintly, a sickly greenish light illuminating the room, casting his shadow long and dark. The shapes shifted, forming twisted shapes, hands, faces, hollow eyes staring back at him, each one filled with a hunger he could feel in his bones. "I am what remains," it whispered. "I am memory. I am fear. I am the darkness between stars, the shadow cast by dying light. I am the void." The words slithered into his mind, entangling with his thoughts, blurring the line between himself and the station. It wasn't just a derelict structure floating in empty space. It was an ancient consciousness, a thing that had drifted through the cosmos for eons, devouring everything in its path, feeding on the fear, despair, and memories of those it ensnared. Voss's legs gave out and he collapsed to his knees, his body feeling heavier, as though something were sinking into him, weighing him down. He could feel it now, a presence slipping into his mind, probing, coiling around his memories, sifting through them with cold curiosity. Fragments of his life flashed before him, his childhood, his first days in training, his crew's faces on the first day they'd taken to space together. Each memory unraveled, slipping from him and sinking into the shadows, merging with the writhing consciousness that surrounded him. "Please," he whispered, his voice barely more than a breath. "Let me go." The voices laughed, a hollow, empty sound, devoid of pity. The Meridian was ancient, vast, beyond anything he could comprehend, and it had no concept of mercy. "There is no escape," it murmured, its voice blending into his thoughts. "You are part of me now. You were always meant to be." He felt a numbness spreading through his limbs, his heartbeat slowing as his body began to fade, his very essence bleeding into the darkness, absorbed by the station. His thoughts fractured, each one splintering into shadows, slipping through his grasp like sand. His identity, his name, his memories, they began to slip away, dissolving into the void. But somewhere deep within, a spark of resistance flickered, a last grasp for meaning, for survival. "Why?" he whispered, his voice trembling. "Why do you do this?" The station was silent for a moment, as if savoring his question, then responded, each word a dagger piercing his mind. "I am eternity. The stars are but sparks, and I am the shadow between them. I consume because I am the darkness. I exist because I am the fear that has no end." As the words filled him, he could feel his remaining thoughts crumbling, his mind splintering into fragments. He was no longer Commander Elias Voss. He was no longer anything. He was becoming one with the Meridian, another echo in the vast emptiness. The chamber grew darker, the symbols pulsing, absorbing him, binding him into the walls, into the very structure. His memories dissipated, his fears, his hopes, all melted into the station's boundless hunger, adding to its eternal, insatiable void. In his last moments of awareness, he could hear them, Jace, Leah, Soren, all of them whispering from the shadows, their voices a faint chorus of despair. Their words echoed in his mind, and he understood now, understood the terrible truth that had awaited them from the moment they'd set foot on the station. They were eternal now, trapped within the dark heartbeat of the Meridian. Each of them, nothing more than shadows, Fragments of fear and memory that would linger, whispering to the next soul who dared to enter. And as the last shred of his identity faded, Voss heard the final words of the Meridian, a promise and a curse that would echo across the dark expanse of space, calling out to any who dared to listen. You belong to the void. The lights flickered and then all went dark,